It all began with Tokuro Fujiwara, a senior producer at Capcom and the creator of the classic horror game Sweet Home. He tasked a young designer named Shinji Mikami with creating a new game with the same atmosphere as Sweet Home. The initial idea was a spiritual successor to that game, a group of people trapped in a haunted and terrifying location. Mikami, a big fan of horror films, especially the zombie-centric works of George A. Romero like Dawn of the Dead, decided to add more modern horror elements to the project. He concluded that monsters closely resembling humans like zombies were far more frightening than ghosts. Thus, the main concept shifted from a haunted house to a mysterious mansion overrun by the victims of a biological experiment. Mikami's idea faced significant technical challenges. The initial concept was to create a first-person horror game with a fully 3D environment. A small team began building a prototype with this vision, but it soon became clear that the hardware of the emerging PlayStation 1 console lacked the power to process such an idea with the desired quality. This technical limitation pushed the team toward a creative solution previously used in the game Alone in the Dark, using pre-rendered backgrounds and placing 3D characters on top of them. This technique not only allowed the team to depict highly detailed environments, but also led to the birth of one of the game's most iconic features, fixed cinematic camera angles. Mikami and his team used this limitation as an artistic tool to instill fear. The fixed camera allowed them to frame shots like a film director, placing creatures in blind spots and creating a constant sense of insecurity for the player. The player never knew what awaited them outside the frame when entering a new hallway or turning a corner. The development team also based the gameplay on 3 core principles. The idea of severely limited ammunition and health items to heighten the sense of survival and vulnerability. The design of environmental puzzles that force the player to explore and think. A tank control system that, while seemingly outdated today, was compatible with the fixed camera angles at the time and added to the feeling of heavy, slow movement in dangerous situations. However, when the main framework of the game took shape, Capcom's executives were not pleased with the result. The main reason for Capcom executives' lack of optimism about the success of the first Resident Evil was rooted in the project's high-risk and commercially unproven nature in the mid-1990s. At that time, the survival horror genre was a fledgling concept without a clear commercial standing, and the video game market was dominated by fast-paced action titles and fighting games. Investing in a game with a heavy atmosphere, slow gameplay, and a focus on resource management was considered a move against the mainstream market. In truth, this doubt existed even among the creators. Shinji Mikami himself admitted he was unsure of a horror game's sales potential, and no one on the team expected it to be a massive success. In fact, Capcom initially had no plans to turn Resident Evil into a long-running series and considered it an experimental, standalone project with a self-contained story. For this reason, Capcom allocated a small budget for the game and decided it would only be produced in Japanese. They were unwilling to risk a simultaneous global release. The initial plan was to launch the game only in Japan first. This was a common strategy for high-risk titles. The company would first gauge the domestic market's reaction and then decide on further investment for an international release. Finally, on March 22, 1996, Resident Evil was released for the PlayStation and achieved success far beyond all expectations. The game was not only a major commercial hit, but also introduced the survival horror genre to the world with its innovative gameplay and unparalleled atmosphere, laying the foundation for one of the most popular franchises in video game history, a calculated nightmare born from the constraints and creativity of a bold team. Resident Evil. Release 1996. Meta 1991. Release platforms: PlayStation, Windows, Sega Saturn, Nintendo DS. Cost: $0.5 million. Sell: 4 million copies. Playtime: Story mode 6 hours. Side missions 2 hours. Completion 15 hours. Everything started with a spark in Shinji Mikami's mind. Inspired by the classic game's Sweet Home, released in 1989, he decided to create a title with an eerie atmosphere set in a mysterious mansion. This ominous place was filled with terrifying creatures called zombies, which played a crucial role in shaping one of the most influential horror games ever. Although Resident Evil wasn't the first survival horror game, nor were zombies new to the world of video games, the idea of developing a horror title aimed at adults at a time when few believed in its success was a major risk. Before that, Only Alone in the Dark, in 1992, had explored the genre, which made Capcom's executives proceed cautiously. They allocated a relatively small budget of $500,000 for the project and initially decided that the game would be developed in Japanese and released only in Japan. If it received a positive reception, they would then create an English version. However, the game not only succeeded, but also paved the way for one of the most famous survival horror franchises. Resident Evil was widely acclaimed by both fans and critics, earning recognition as one of the most important games in history, with a lasting impact on the gaming industry. With a 91 score, it ranks among the best video games ever, selling 4 million copies. It generated around $200 million in revenue for Capcom, which was far beyond the initial budget of $500,000, turning it into more just a commercial success. The game's story unfolds in Spencer Mansion, a mysterious location filled with secrets. A special task force, STARS, is sent to investigate strange occurrences in the forests surrounding Raccoon City. However, they soon realize they are trapped in a terrifying nightmare. Players can take control of Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, navigating a world infested with zombies and mutated monsters, fighting for survival. Limited ammunition, complex puzzles, and a tense atmosphere are key elements of the game, successfully conveying fear and anxiety to players. The story behind the name Resident Evil I is quite interesting. Initially, Capcom launched the game in Japan under the title Biohazard, but when they decided to expand internationally, they discovered that the name was already trademarked for another product. As a result, Capcom had to change the name, ultimately settling on Resident Evil for global markets. However, in Japan, the franchise is still known as Biohazard, and subsequent installments continued to be released under this name. Resident Evil 2. Release 1998. Meta 89. Release platforms: PlayStation, Windows, Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, GameCube. Cost $5 million. Sell 6 million copies. Playtime: Story mode 6 hours. Side missions 3 completionist 15 hours. Following the massive success of Resident Evil 1, Capcom wasted no time and immediately started working on its sequel. This time, fully aware of the franchise's enormous potential, they increased the game's budget tenfold to $5 million, giving the development team 2 years to create a bigger and richer experience than the first game. The world of Resident Evil 2 expanded significantly compared to its predecessor, unlike the original, which mostly took place within the confined walls of Spencer Mansion, players could now explore Raccoon City's streets, the police station, the city's underground sewers, and Umbrella's research facility. The game also saw major improvements in controls, gameplay, technical graphics, and storytelling. The story is set 2 months after the events of the first game, when the T-virus has spread across Raccoon City, turning all living creatures into zombies. This time, the game introduces 2 playable protagonists. Leon S. Kennedy, a rookie police officer about to begin his first day at the Raccoon City Police Department, unaware of the viral outbreak that awaits him. Claire Redfield, who arrives in Raccoon City searching for clues about her missing brother. The 2 cross paths by chance, and as the story unfolds, they must work together to survive and escape the city. The gameplay is a blend of action, adventure, and survival horror, featuring challenging puzzles, key, and item hunting, combining resources for later use and intense battles against both regular enemies and powerful bosses. The fixed third-person camera angles, previously introduced in the first game, remained one of the game's key distinctions from other titles of that era, with multiple difficulty settings and the ability to play as 2 unique protagonists, each with their own storylines, weapons, and paths. Resident Evil 2 boasted high replay value. The game received exceptional reception, earning a score of 89 from critics, and its sales surpassed 6 million copies. Initially released on 2 discs for PlayStation 1, one of the most fascinating aspects of its development was Capcom's ability to fit the game onto Nintendo 64 cartridges. Despite the console's storage limit of just 64 megabytes, this impressive compression technique remains one of the most remarkable feats in the game's development history. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Release 1999. Meta 91. Release platforms: PlayStation, Windows, Dreamcast, GameCube. Costs $2 million. Sell 3.5 million copies. Playtime: Story mode 6 hours. Side missions to completion is 15 hours. At this stage, Capcom had realized that Resident Evil had become one of the most profitable franchises in the gaming industry. Initially, the 3rd installment was planned as a spin-off with a $2 million budget, which was about half the cost of developing Resident Evil 2. However, as the game evolved and its story and gameplay potential became clear, Capcom decided to position it as the official 3rd entry in the series. Some of its standout features included enhanced graphics, a gripping storyline, and an intense atmosphere, which effectively amplified the feeling of anxiety and tension among players. Raccoon City was artistically designed, with visual elements such as abandoned cars, destroyed streets, shattered windows, and dilapidated buildings, all conveying the downfall of a once thriving city. The zombies and other enemies, thanks to graphical improvements, look more realistic and terrifying. Additionally, Jill Valentine was redesigned to be more dynamic, and visually appealing compared to her first appearance in the original game. One of the most notable aspects of the game was the introduction of Nemesis, the main antagonist, whose name and image were even placed on the game's cover. Nemesis, depicted as a relentless and merciless threat, created moments filled with fear and heart-pounding chases, keeping players on edge. Furthermore, a new gameplay feature was added, allowing players to react differently to enemy encounters, something not present in previous games. This system gave players the choice between escaping or fighting, making split-second decisions significantly impact gameplay. The story of Resident Evil 3 takes place alongside Resident Evil 2, with events starting one day before Resident Evil 2.
and concluding 2 days after its ending, Jill Valentine, the game's protagonist, also a playable character from the first Resident Evil, is forced to find a way to escape after zombies attack her home. Meanwhile, Umbrella Corporation, attempting to silence the remaining STARS members, sends a tyrant named Nemesis to eliminate the team. Now, Jill must survive the horrors of the city while evading Nemesis, leading to a tense and thrilling experience. The game was highly praised, earning a 91% score from critics, and sales surpassed 3.5 million copies. Although this was a strong commercial performance, it was about half of Resident Evil 2's sales, signaling that Capcom needed to rethink its formula and introduce more fundamental changes to the franchise. Resident Evil Survivor. Release 2000. Meta 39. Release platforms: PlayStation, Windows. Cost unknown. Sell 1.5 million copies. Playtime: Story Mode 2 hours. Completion 4 hours. In 2000, Capcom released the first spin-off of the Resident Evil series, but the game faced harsh criticism from reviewers. The camera perspective shifted from third person to first person, and making the game feel more like a pure action title. The game's issues were quite notable: weak and low quality graphics, a shallow and underdeveloped storyline, incomplete and flawed gameplay, short duration that the game could be completed in less than 2 hours. This game received a low score of 39 from critics, and not only is it considered the worst Resident Evil title after Umbrella Core, but it is also regarded as one of Capcom's weakest games. Despite its poor reception, the game managed to sell 1.5 million copies. This success was mainly due to the fact that, at the time, any gamers didn't have quick access to game reviews like they do today, and purchased it solely based on the franchise name. It's easy to imagine that many fans, after the success of Resident Evil 3, bought the game hoping for a new installment, only to be met with a huge disappointment. It's best not to waste any more time on this title. Resident Evil Code Veronica. Release 2000. Meta 94. Platforms: Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, GameCube, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360. Cost 10 million. Sell 2.5 million copies. Playtime: Story Mode 12 hours. Side missions 2 hours. Completion 14 hours. The year 2000 was a year of stark contrast, as for the Resident Evil series. On one hand, there was Resident Evil Survivor, with a score of 39. That is considered one of the weakest games in the franchise. On the other hand, there was Resident Evil Code Veronica, with a score of 94, is considered one of the best titles released in the Resident Evil series. First and foremost, it must be said that the game was initially released as an exclusive for the Dreamcast console, Sega's last console, which unfortunately faced commercial failure. Despite critical acclaim, the game did not achieve high sales due to the limited number of Dreamcast users. Therefore, Capcom ended the exclusivity a year later and released the game in 2001 as Resident Evil Code Veronica X for PlayStation 2 console. Code Veronica was the first game in the series to utilize fully 3D environments. Instead of pre-rendered 2D backgrounds, the camera angle was similar to previous installments, but this time the camera followed the main character, providing greater depth to the 3D environment. The graphics, reactions, and artificial intelligence of the enemies were significantly improved compared to the previous 3 games. Furthermore, This title was the first game in the series, developed and released for 6th generation consoles. The game's story takes place after the events of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Claire Redfield, one of the main characters in Resident Evil 2, after failing to find her missing brother in Raccoon City, travels to Rockfort Island in Antarctica 3 months after the city's destruction in search of clues about Chris Redfield. The game's story is considered one of its main strengths, and many fans regard it as one of the best narrative storylines in the history of the Resident Evil franchise. Despite the game's high quality, its sales never reached the level it deserved, selling only 2.5 million copies. We hope that one day, a remake of this valuable title will be made, providing greater depth to the 3D environment. The graphics, reactions, and artificial intelligence of the enemies were significantly improved compared to the previous 3 games. Furthermore, this title was the first game in the series, developed and released for 6th generation consoles. The game's story takes place after the events of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Claire Redfield, one of the main characters in Resident Evil 2, after failing to find her missing brother in Raccoon City, travels to Rockfort Island in Antarctica 3 months after the city's destruction in search of clues about Chris Redfield. The game's story is considered one of its main strengths, and many fans regard it as one of the best narrative storylines in the history of the Resident Evil franchise. Despite the game's high quality, its sales never reached the level it deserved, selling only 2.5 million copies. We hope that one day, a remake of this valuable title will be made. Resident Evil Survivor 2, Code Veronica. Release 2001. Meta unknown. Platforms: arcade, PlayStation 2. Cost unknown. Sell unknown. Playtime: story mode 45 minutes. In 2001, Capcom, in collaboration with Namco, decided to build a dedicated arcade machine exclusively for gaming centers. The game that ran on this machine, unlike the main series games, was a completely action-oriented title with no story, where 2 players could simultaneously move through the game map and kill zombies using 2 independent monitors. The machine's controls were also designed as realistic guns. The dimensions of this machine were 1.5 meters wide, 2.1 meters high, and it weighed 330 kilograms. The completion time for the game was around 45 minutes, and players had to repeat the game to increase their high score. Up to this point, everything seemed cool, even interesting and innovative. However, things went wrong when, a year later in 2002, Capcom decided to release the game for PlayStation 2, and that's where everything fell apart. The console version lacked the special arcade controls that made the game experience unique. The game ended in 45 minutes, and none of the attractions of the arcade version, including simultaneous 2-player gameplay with 2 separate monitors, were preserved. The game was so weak that no critics even bothered to review it, and no scores were recorded for it. So it's probably best if we don't talk about it anymore. Resident Evil Gaiden. Release 2001. Meta 56. Release platform Game Boy Color. Cost unknown. Sell unknown. Playtime: story mode 4 hours. Side missions 2 hours. Completion 9 hours. This was the first time a Resident Evil game was released for a handheld console. The game's camera angle was top-down and switched to a first-person perspective when fighting enemies. In this mode, the aiming reticle moved dynamically from right to left, and players had to shoot enemies when the reticle was within the enemy's range. The game's story took place concurrently with Resident Evil Code Veronica. Leon S. Kennedy was tasked with confronting enemies aboard a passenger ship that had suffered a biological incident. Given the hardware limitations of the Game Boy console, the game's graphics and gameplay were not particularly impressive. Similarly, audience reception wasn't very high, as few people were interested in experiencing a horror game with such a style on a handheld console.
Resident Evil Remaster. Release 2002. Meta 91. Release platform GameCube. Cost unknown. Sell unknown. Playtime. Story mode 11 hours. Side missions 2 hours. Completion 29 hours. In 2002, Capcom decided to remake the first game in the Resident Evil series, and Shinji Mikami exclusively released it for Nintendo's new console, the GameCube. In 2008, this game was also released for Nintendo's next console, the Nintendo Wii. This title remained exclusive to Nintendo consoles for 13 years until 2015, when a remastered version with HD graphics was released for other platforms, including Microsoft Windows, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, Xbox 360, and Xbox One. The remake not only improved in terms of technical and visual graphics compared to the original version, but its story and gameplay also underwent fundamental changes. According to Shinji Mikami, the remade Resident Evil had 70% story and structural changes compared to the previous version. For example, the duration of the game's story mode increased from 6 hours to 11 hours, indicating an expansion of the game's content. This game, like the original, managed to receive a score of 91 from critics and was met with widespread acclaim from gamers. Precise information about the sales figures for the GameCube and Wii versions is not available, but the HD remastered version had sold approximately 2.8 million copies by the end of 2020. Resident Evil 0. Release 2002. Meta 83. Release platform GameCube. Cost unknown. Sell 5 million copies. Playtime. Story mode 11 hours. Side missions 2 hours. Completion 23 hours. The collaboration between Nintendo and Capcom resulted in the creation of two significant games, one being the remastered version of Resident Evil 1, which we discussed earlier, and the other, a completely new game titled Resident Evil 0, which serves as a prequel to the main Resident Evil trilogy. Chronologically, this game is considered the first title in the Resident Evil game series. This game was released exclusively for the Nintendo GameCube in 2002, and 6 years later in 2008, it also came to market for the Nintendo Wii. Resident Evil 0 remained exclusive to Nintendo consoles for 14 years until 2016, when its HD remastered version was released for Microsoft Windows, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, Xbox 360, and Xbox One. The game's story takes place directly before the events of the first game, where Rebecca Chambers, a rookie member of STRS with medical and first aid expertise, is sent to the Spencer Mansion for a mission. She travels by train to her destination but soon realizes that the train is full of zombies and mutated creatures. On this train, she encounters Billy Cohen, a former Navy lieutenant who has been convicted of murder. Despite initial distrust, the two are forced to cooperate to survive and uncover the mystery behind this biological disaster. It soon becomes clear that the Umbrella Corporation is behind this catastrophe, and they must find a way to escape this nightmare. One of the new and prominent gameplay mechanics in this version was the ability to control two characters simultaneously. The player could switch between Rebecca and Billy and utilize their unique abilities to solve puzzles and confront enemies. Although Resident Evil 0 did not reach the same level of acclaim as the main Resident Evil trilogy or Resident Evil Code, Veronica, it managed to provide an enjoyable and valuable experience for fans of the series and, with its high sales, also satisfied Capcom's executives. Resident Evil Dead Aim. Release 2003. Meta 65. Release platform PlayStation 2. Cost unknown. Sell unknown. Playtime. Story mode 3 hours. Completion 4 hours. Resident Evil Dead Aim is considered one of the lesser-known titles in the Resident Evil series, with few people being familiar with it, and I myself didn't have much information about it before writing this article. This marked the first time we witnessed a third-person perspective in the Resident Evil series, making it an innovation in this regard. The camera angle was a hybrid of third-person and first-person. Players moved and explored the environment in a third-person view, and when confronting enemies for aiming and shooting, the game switched to first-person. This combination made Resident Evil Dead Aim distinct from other spin-off titles in the series. The game's story took place in 2002, where a terrorist group takes control of a passenger ship. On the ship, they release the T-virus, turning the passengers into zombies and mutated creatures. Bruce McGivern, an agent of the US anti-terrorist organization, along with Fong Ling, a Chinese police officer, are tasked with infiltrating the ship for investigation. As you can see, none of the main characters from the Resident Evil game series were used in this game, and the two introduced characters have not appeared in any other game. The game also had no story connection to the other games. Resident Evil Dead Aim was a short game, so much so that it could be completed in 3 hours, and it was never released for any platform other than PlayStation 2. In fact, the game can be seen as a project to practice changing the camera perspective of Resident Evil games and bringing the series into the 3D world, with Capcom primarily wanting to gauge gamers' feedback on the change in camera angle. This trial and error ultimately led to the creation of a masterpiece called Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil Outbreak. Release 2003. Meta 71. Release platform PlayStation 2. Cost unknown. Sell unknown. Playtime. Story mode 8 hours. Side missions 4 hours. Completion 20 hours. By 2003, and after the release of Resident Evil 3, a total of 7 spin-off titles from the Resident Evil series had been released. While everyone expected to see the 4th installment of the main series, Capcom once again launched a spin-off title. Resident Evil Outbreak was a co-op game that, although it had the option to be played solo, primarily focused on online multiplayer cooperation. The game could be experienced online with up to 4 players, or offline with 1 player and 2 AI companions. There were 9 playable characters in this game, none of whom were from the main Resident Evil cast and were considered new faces in the series universe. As players progressed through the game and earned points, more characters became available for selection. The game's story takes place during the time frame of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 and narrates the beginning of the T-virus outbreak in Raccoon City, the transformation of citizens into zombies, and ultimately the city's destruction by a nuclear bomb. Resident Evil Outbreak managed to receive a respectable score of 71 as an online co-op game and found its own dedicated fanbase. Resident Evil Outbreak File 2. Release 2004. Meta 58. Release platform PlayStation 2. Cost unknown. Sell unknown. Playtime. Story mode 10 hours. Side missions 30 hours. Completion 139 hours. Following the moderate reception of the first game, Capcom released a new version. This game was essentially an enhanced version of Resident Evil Outbreak, offering some improvements and changes compared to its predecessor. The main differences included new and diverse scenarios that expanded the game's story. Additionally, some game mechanics, such as character control and environmental interaction, had been improved. New online modes were added to the game, and the online section became more stable. Unlike the first game, critics were not satisfied with the second game and gave it a score of 58. The game's servers were also shut down after 3 years in 2007 due to a lack of audience interest. Resident Evil 4. Release 2005. Meta 96. Release platforms GameCube, PlayStation 2, Windows. Cost $10 to $15 million. Sell 13 million copies. Playtimes: Story mode 15 hours, Story mode plus side missions 19 hours, Completionist 31 hours. Resident Evil 4, released in 2005, didn't just revolutionize the video game world. It was more than a mere sequel. It was a bold and masterful redefinition of the survival horror genre. Abandoning the fixed camera angles characteristic of earlier Resident Evil titles, the game introduced an innovative over-the-shoulder perspective. This revolutionized third-person gameplay, enabling more precise aiming and delivering a more cinematic, action-heavy experience. The game wasn't just transformative for the Resident Evil series and the survival horror genre, it fundamentally changed the video game industry, profoundly influencing the design of subsequent third-person action games. Boasting a Metacritic score of 96, Resident Evil 4 ranks among the highest-rated games of all time. Initially launched as a GameCube exclusive, this timed exclusivity fortunately didn't last long. Just 10 months later, the game was released on other platforms as well. The story follows Special Agent Leon S. Kennedy, dispatched to a remote village in Spain on a mission to rescue Ashley Graham, the US President's daughter. The area is controlled by the enigmatic Los Iluminados cult, whose members have been infected by the Las Plagas parasite, turning them violent and hostile. The game also features an additional scenario titled Separate Ways, starring the enigmatic and fan-favorite character Ada Wong. Its narrative runs parallel to Leon S. Kennedy's main campaign, revealing Ada's behind-the-scenes actions and clandestine objectives during Leon's mission. The primary purpose of this mode is to fill narrative gaps, showcase Ada's interactions with other key characters, like Albert Wesker, Luis Serra, and Jack Krauser, and shed light on her motivations, particularly concerning the acquisition of a Las Plagas parasite sample. Completing this side story takes approximately 3 hours. The game's success extended far beyond critical acclaim. Fans enthusiastically embraced it as well. Resident Evil 4 achieved massive commercial success, selling over 13 million copies across various platforms over the years, making it one of Capcom's and the Resident Evil franchise's best-selling titles. Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles. Release 2007. Meta 75. Release platforms: PlayStation 3, Wii. Cost unknown. Sell 1.5 million copies. Playtime, main story 8 hours. Main story plus extras 11 hours. Completionist 25 hours. Marking another collaboration between Capcom and Nintendo, Resident Evil. The Umbrella Chronicles was Capcom's first exclusive title for the Nintendo Wii console. Unlike most entries in the Resident Evil series, this game deviates from the focus on exploration and puzzle solving, instead offering a purely action-oriented experience. The gameplay features an on-rails perspective where the camera moves automatically through environments, removing player control over movement like walking or running. The game guides players along a predetermined path, tasking them solely with aiming and firing at hordes of familiar zombies and monsters from the series. Notably, there are no ammunition limits. The emphasis is entirely on precise aiming and rapid firing. This arcade-style gameplay, combined with the Wii Remote's motion controls, provided an engaging experience on the platform. The narrative revisits key events and iconic moments from Resident Evil 0, Resident Evil 1, and Resident Evil 3. Nemesis, presenting them from a fresh perspective and adding further detail. This includes the ordeal of Rebecca Chambers and Billy Cohen aboard the train and within the Umbrella training facility. The terrifying events unfolding in the Spencer Mansion featuring Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine. Jill Valentine's desperate struggle for survival in the collapsing Raccoon City, her confrontation with the relentless Nemesis, and segments experienced from Carlos Oliveira's viewpoint. Perhaps the most compelling story element involves entirely new scenarios delving into the events following Raccoon City's destruction and chronicling the final stages of Umbrella Corporation's downfall. 5 years later, in 2012, an enhanced version with improved graphics was released for the PlayStation 3. This version supported gameplay using either the PlayStation Move motion controller or the standard DualShock controller. In summary, Resident Evil, the Umbrella Chronicles is regarded as an arcade-style, on-rail shooter spin-off designed to retell significant portions of the series' history through a different gameplay lens, while also introducing new lore. Critics and players who understood its genre and tempered their expectations accordingly often found enjoyment, particularly praising its co-op mode and narrative additions. However, for fans seeking the traditional deep survival horror experience characteristic of the mainline titles, the game was often seen as a letdown. This divergence in expectations led to a mixed overall reception, generally ranging from average to moderately positive. Resident Evil 5, release 2009, meta 86, release platforms PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, Xbox 360, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, PC, cost $30 to $50 million, sell 14 million copies, playtime main story 12 hours, main story plus extras 17 hours, completionist 35 hours. Following the phenomenal success of Resident Evil 4, Capcom faced the daunting task of developing Resident Evil 5. The resulting game, while not reaching the same level of critical acclaim or fan adoration as Resident Evil 4, did manage to outsell its predecessor, having sold 13.3 million copies, as reported around the time this video was made, early 2025, likely referring to specific platform versions or initial releases. It stood as one of the franchise's major commercial successes at the time. The game's story is set in the fictional African region of Kijuju. In this installment, veteran BSAA agent Chris Redfield, partnering with newcomer Sheva Alomar, investigates a new bioterrorist threat transforming the local populace into aggressive creatures known as Majini. Their investigation quickly uncovers a larger conspiracy revolving around the Tricell Corporation, the lethal Ouroboros virus, and the return of Chris's longtime adversary, Albert Wesker, harboring ambitions of global transformation. Despite significant commercial success and delivering a thrilling action experience with impressive graphics for its time, Resident Evil 5 drew significant criticism from many series veterans and critics. These critiques stem from two key interconnected gameplay decisions: the compulsory inclusion of a permanent partner and the partner's often poor and frustrating artificial intelligence, AI, in single-player mode. While this design choice could enhance the experience when playing cooperatively with friends, the problem became starkly apparent in single player. It was here that the AI's numerous weaknesses often caused the partner to act more like a hindrance or liability than reliable support. Furthermore, the narrative leaned heavily into flashy action sequences and Hollywood tropes. The suspense, eerie atmosphere, and psychological horror, elements still somewhat present in Resident Evil 4, were largely supplanted by relentless action sequences, frequent explosions, and often simplistic, cliché dialogue. Wesker's ultimate plan for world domination felt overly exaggerated and cartoonish, lacking the narrative nuance of earlier installments. The new character, Sheva Alomar, despite her integral role in gameplay, lacked significant character depth and largely functioned as Chris's sidekick. In my view, the game's primary failing was its departure from the series' survival horror roots in favor of becoming a pure action title, a trajectory that unfortunately culminated in Resident Evil 6, a game often criticized for feeling more akin to Call of Duty than Resident Evil. Resident Evil: The Dakside Chronicles. Release 2009. Meta 75. Release platforms: Wii, PS3. Cost unknown. Sell 1.5 million copies. Playtime: main story 8 hours, main story plus extras 12 hours, completionist 25 hours. Resident Evil: The Dakside Chronicles serves as a sequel to the Umbrella Chronicles and is another rail shooter entry in the Resident Evil franchise. Following the formula of its predecessor, the game retells significant plot points from the series, this time focusing on the events of Resident Evil 2, featuring Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield's story in Raccoon City, and Resident Evil: Code Veronica, detailing Claire Redfield's experiences on Rockfort Island and in Antarctica. A key new addition is the Operation Javier scenario. This entirely original storyline, set before the events of Resident Evil 4, partners Leon S. Kennedy with Jack Krauser on a perilous mission in South America. This scenario delves into the development of the complex relationship between the two characters. The core gameplay remains centered on aiming and shooting along predetermined paths. However, the Dakside Chronicles aims for a darker, more cinematic feel through enhanced graphics compared to the previous title, and the implementation of a shaky cam effect designed to heighten the sense of anxiety and chaos. It also places a greater emphasis on the dramatic elements of the character narratives. Overall reception was comparable to the Umbrella Chronicles, generally mixed to positive, and it was often viewed as a minor improvement over the prior game. In conclusion, while regarded as an entertaining rail shooter spin-off valuable for its narrative additions, particularly the new scenario, limitations inherent to the genre and specific design choices, such as the shaky camera, prevented it from achieving universal acclaim. Resident Evil: The Mercenaried 3D. Release 2011. Meta 65. Release platforms: 3DS. Cost unknown. Sell unknown. Playtime: main story 5 hours, main story plus extras 24 hours, completionist 108 hours. Resident Evil: The Mercenaried 3D was an exclusive title released for the Nintendo 3DS handheld console, built entirely around the popular The Mercenaries mode featured in Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5. Lacking a dedicated story mode, the game offers a purely arcade-style, action-driven score attack experience. Players select from a roster of iconic Resident Evil characters, such as Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Albert Wesker, and Hunk, each equipped with unique loadouts and abilities to tackle timed stages. The primary objective is to eliminate as many enemies as possible within the strict time limits to achieve the highest score. Executing melee attacks and maintaining kill combos are crucial strategies for extending the timer and maximizing points. The game also incorporated a skill upgrade system and offered two-player cooperative gameplay through both local and online connections, while utilizing the 3DS console's stereoscopic 3D feature. Graphically, Resident Evil: The Mercenaries 3D was considered a commendable technical achievement for the Nintendo 3DS back in 2011. It successfully translated much of the visual style and atmosphere of the series' console installments onto the portable platform. Naturally, however, it wasn't technically comparable to the graphical fidelity of contemporary home console releases, or even more advanced titles later released on the 3DS itself. However, the game faced significant and harsh criticism primarily due to its severe lack of content. It was essentially perceived as an expanded minigame being marketed and sold at the price point of a full retail release. This resulted in the gameplay quickly becoming repetitive for many players, leading to criticism about its low-value proposition. In summary, while the core gameplay loop itself was generally found to be enjoyable, Resident Evil: The Mercenaries 3D as a complete package failed to deliver sufficient content to justify its standing as a standalone full-priced product. Resident Evil: Revelations. Release 2012. Meta 82. Release platforms: Nintendo 3DS, PS3, Xbox 360, Wii U, PC. Cost: unknown. Sell: unknown. Playtime: main story 8 hours, main plus extras 13 hours, completionist 36 hours. Resident Evil: Revelations was first released in 2012 as an exclusive for the Nintendo 3DS console, and was released for other consoles and personal computers a year later. Following several mainline and spin-off entries in the series that had strayed from the roots of survival horror, this game marked a return to the series' core elements. The story primarily takes place in the closed, claustrophobic, and eerie environment of a seemingly abandoned cruise ship named the Queen Zenobia. Players take on the role of Jill Valentine and her partner, Parker Luciani, who board the mysterious vessel to find Chris Redfield. They quickly find themselves in the midst of a major conspiracy involving a new virus called the T-Abyss and a terrorist organization named Veltro. Similar to older titles in the series, the gameplay focused on exploration, solving environmental puzzles, managing limited ammunition and resources, and combating enemies. One of the key mechanics was the use of a scanner device called the Genesis to find hidden items and analyze enemies and bosses. In addition to its episodic story mode, the title also featured a co-op and arcade-style section called Raid Mode. Critics praised the game for its successful return to the survival horror genre's roots. The captivating and suspenseful atmosphere, especially on the ship, the tense, resource management-based gameplay, and the impressive graphics at the time of its 3DS release were among the game's most prominent strengths. Furthermore, the addictive and popular Raid Mode was met with widespread acclaim. Resident Evil: Operation Raccoon City. Release 2012. Meta 52. Release platforms: PlayStation 3, Xbox, Windows. Cost: unknown. Sell 2 million copies. Playtime: Main story, 6 hours. Main plus extras, 8 hours. Completionist, 16 hours. Released in 2012, Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City is considered one of the weakest titles in the entire Resident Evil series. This squad-based shooter spin-off attempted to narrate the story events of Resident Evil 2 and 3 from the perspective of an Umbrella Special Forces squad. While the idea seemed appealing on paper, its disastrous execution led to a major failure. The gameplay was flawed and broken. The game completely distanced itself from its survival horror roots, becoming a generic third-person action title. The disastrous AI of both teammates and enemies, a flawed cover system, and clunky controls made the experience extremely frustrating. Unlike the main installments, there was no resource management, puzzle solving, or suspenseful atmosphere. Everything was reduced to mindlessly shooting at waves of enemies. In addition to these issues, the game suffered from numerous bugs and technical problems that detracted from the overall experience. Ultimately, with very low scores from critics and a negative reaction from fans, Operation Raccoon City is known as an unsuccessful attempt to change the series' direction and a stain on the history of Resident Evil, a game that failed to achieve any of its goals. Resident Evil 6, released 2012. Meta 74. Release platforms: PlayStation 3 and 4, Xbox 360 and 1, Windows. Cost unknown. Sell 14.3 million copies. Playtime: main story 21 hours, main plus extras 27 hours, completionist 52 hours. Resident Evil 6, released in 2012, is considered one of the most controversial titles in the entire series. The game completely moved away from the series' survival horror roots, becoming a full-fledged Hollywood-style action game, which sparked varied reactions among fans and critics. This change was not at all well received by critics and hardcore fans of the series, but at the same time, it attracted a very large audience and achieved massive sales. The game's main strength is its vast amount of content and its length. With 4 separate story campaigns featuring popular characters like Leon S. Kennedy, Chris Redfield, and Ada Wong, Resident Evil 6 is considered one of the longest games in the series, taking over 20 hours to complete. Each campaign attempts to offer a different feel, from the struggle for survival in Leon's campaign to the military action in Chris's section. However, the biggest criticism of the game is its fragmented identity and excessive focus on action. Critics believe the game had lost its core identity, turning into a third-person shooter filled with cinematic scenes and non-stop explosions, devoid of the heavy atmosphere and resource management that were staples of the original Resident Evil. Commercially, Resident Evil 6 was a huge success. With over 14.7 million copies sold to date, it is one of the best-selling titles for Capcom and in the Resident Evil series. However, this commercial success was met with a cold reception from critics. The game's Metacritic score on major platforms was around 67 out of 100, which is one of the lowest scores among the main titles in the series, indicating a deep divide between the views of critics and its commercial performance. In summary, Resident Evil 6 is an entertaining and very long action game that can satisfy you if you're looking for a cinematic, action-packed experience. But if you are a longtime fan of the series and expect a terrifying title that is faithful to its roots, this game will likely disappoint you. Resident Evil Revelations 2, released 2015. Meta 75. Release platforms: PlayStation 3 and 4, Xbox 360 and 1, Windows. Cost unknown. Sell 3.7 million copies. Playtime: main story 10 hours, main plus extras 16 hours, completionist 35 hours. Resident Evil Revelations 2, released episodically in 2015, was a successful attempt by Capcom to bring the series back to its survival horror atmosphere and move away from the pure chaotic action of Resident Evil 6. The game was well received by critics and longtime fans, managing to strike an engaging balance between action, puzzle solving, and a suspenseful atmosphere. The story is split into two parallel timelines and celebrates the return of beloved classic characters, Claire Redfield and Barry Burton. Claire is imprisoned on an island with Moira Burton, Barry's daughter, and 6 months later, Barry arrives on the same island to find his daughter, accompanied by a mysterious little girl named Natalia. The episodic narrative, filled with cliffhangers, effectively built suspense and curiosity in the player. One of the main gameplay innovations was the asymmetrical co-op mechanic. In each section, there was a combat-focused character, Claire and Barry, and a support character, Moira with a flashlight and Natalia with sensory abilities. This system forced the player to constantly switch between the two characters to progress and survive, which added more depth to the gameplay. However, the game was not without its flaws. The use of repetitive environments in Barry's storyline, as he often follows Claire's path, and the technical graphics, which were not on par with mainline titles due to a lower budget, were among the criticisms leveled against it. The great strength of Revelations 2 is its addictive and expansive raid mode. This arcade-style mode, with its abundance of missions, playable characters, weapons, and an RPG-based upgrade system, gave the game tremendous replay value and offered hours of entertaining content. Overall, Resident Evil. Revelations 2 is a worthy and well-crafted spin-off title that, with its focus on classic survival horror elements, creative cooperative gameplay, and a compelling story, delivers an enjoyable experience for both old fans and newcomers alike. Resident Evil Umbrella Corps. Release 2015. Meta 38. Release platforms PlayStation 4, Windows. Cost unknown. Sell unknown. Playtime. Main story 7 hours, main plus extras 11 hours, completionist 23 hours. Resident Evil Umbrella Corps, released in 2016, was a disastrous attempt by Capcom to enter the world of competitive online shooters. Not only did it face absolute failure, but it is also known as the worst and most despised game in the entire history of the Resident Evil series. This title was a fully multiplayer, team-based spin-off that bore no resemblance to the identity, atmosphere, or survival horror elements of the franchise. The gameplay was a complete mess. Character controls were slow and imprecise, the cover system was dysfunctional, and the shooting mechanics were unbalanced. The maps were extremely small and poorly designed, leading to aimless conflicts and total chaos. The game suffered from contradictory ideas. For instance, it was a cover-based shooter, where using cover was practically detrimental to the player. The presence of zombies on the map, instead of creating a strategic challenge, became an annoying and unpredictable element that often led to unfair deaths. Due to its low quality, lack of sufficient content, and weak gameplay, the title was quickly abandoned by players, and its online community vanished almost within the first week. The game's catastrophic performance is also clearly reflected in its scores. With an average Metascore of 38 out of 100, Umbrella Corps is officially the lowest rated title in the entire series. This failure was so significant that Capcom never provided precise sales figures. However, we know that the game is not on Capcom's Platinum Titles list, which includes games with over 1 million copies sold. This indicates that the total sales for the game on PlayStation 4 and PC were less than 1 million units. a complete commercial and critical failure for the great name of Resident Evil. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Release 2017. Meta 86. Release platforms PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox One and Series, Windows. Cost unknown. Sell 15 million copies. Playtime. Main story 9 hours, main plus extras 12 hours, completionist 27 hours. Resident Evil 7. Biohazard, released in 2017, was not just a game, but a complete rejuvenation for a series that had lost its identity after recent action-oriented installments. Released after a 5-year gap since the 6th entry, and amidst much skepticism, the game managed to powerfully return the series to its survival horror roots with a bold change of direction. The biggest and most significant change was the shift in camera perspective from third person to first person. This decision, which initially worried some fans, was executed in the best way possible, elevating the sense of immersion and terror to an unprecedented level for the franchise. The Hollywood-style action and the slaughter of hundreds of zombies were gone. Instead, the player, as Ethan Winters, was trapped in the tight, dark corridors of the Baker family mansion, where every shadow and sound could be the source of a deadly threat. With a significant reduction in action and a focus on exploration, puzzle solving, limited resource management, and escaping from powerful enemies, Resident Evil 7 was exactly what longtime fans had wished for. The heavy atmosphere, mysterious story, and constant feeling of powerlessness and vulnerability created a deeply terrifying and breathtaking experience. This successful return to its roots brought resounding satisfaction from both critics and longtime fans of the series. Critics praised the game for its courage to change, its outstanding art direction, and for creating one of the most terrifying experiences of its generation. Players were also extremely pleased to finally experience a truly scary and authentic Resident Evil. Resident Evil 7 proved that the series could still be a leader in the horror genre and paved the way for its successful future. Resident Evil 2 Remake. Release 2019. Meta 93. Release platforms PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox One and Series, Windows. Cost unknown. Sell 15 million copies. Playtime. Main story 9 hours, main plus extras 15 hours, completionist 36 hours. Resident Evil 2 Remake, released in 2019, is not just a remake, but a glorious rebirth of one of the most beloved titles in video game history. This game is an absolute success and a masterclass in how to modernize a classic, earning the unconditional praise of critics and the complete satisfaction of both old and new fans. From the very beginning, this masterpiece set a new standard for the survival horror genre with its heavy atmosphere, stunning graphics, and flawless gameplay. By staying true to the core story and memorable environments of the 1998 original, Capcom succeeded in creating a deeply terrifying, thrilling, and yet thoroughly modern experience that captured the hearts of fans. The game's success is best reflected in its scores. With an amazing score of 93 out of 100 on Metacritic, Resident Evil 2 Remake has cemented its place in history. This outstanding score makes it one of the very few elite titles in the entire series to have surpassed the 90-point threshold, placing it on par with the greatest classics of all time. This incredible reception was not limited to critics. The game became a massive commercial success for Capcom with very high sales, over 13.9 million units, and brought the utmost satisfaction to fans. Players worldwide praised the game for its masterful recreation of Raccoon City, and for delivering one of the best horror experiences of its generation. Without a doubt, Resident Evil 2 Remake is an absolute triumph and one of the best games ever made. Ever. Resident Evil 3 Remake. Release 2020. Meta 84. Release platforms PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox One and Series, Windows. Cost unknown. Sell 10 million copies. Playtime. Main story 6 hours, main plus extras 7 hours, completionist 20 hours. Resident Evil 3 Remake, released in 2020 just 1 year after the spectacular success of the second game's remake, is a well-made and exciting action horror game. This title was released as a complete package, bundled with a separate multiplayer component called Resident Evil Resistance, but its single-player campaign always stands in the heavy shadow of its older, more successful sibling. The game delivers a cinematic, action-packed experience with stunning visuals and fluid gameplay that will satisfy action fans. The game's strengths lie in its fantastic graphics, the flawless character model for Jill Valentine, and the new dodge mechanic, which adds more speed and depth to combat. The encounters with Nemesis in the cinematic scripted moments are designed to be very breathtaking and thrilling. However, the game also faced significant criticism. The biggest critique was its short story campaign and the removal of some key, memorable areas from the original game, like the clock tower. Furthermore, with a significant increase in action and a more linear path, the game distanced itself from the sense of survival horror and exploration that was present in the Resident Evil 2 Remake. In comparison, Resident Evil 3 Remake was not as complete or flawless of a work as the remake of the second game. This was reflected in the reception. The game received lower scores from critics, and despite good sales, ultimately had lower sales than Resident Evil 2. Overall, Resident Evil 3 is not a weak remake, but rather an entertaining, fast-paced, and very polished experience that can be enjoyable if you approach it with the right expectations. It is a good companion piece to Resident Evil 2, but it never manages to achieve the esteemed status of its predecessor as an unrepeatable masterpiece. Resident Evil Village. Release 2021. Meta 84. Release platforms PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox One and Series, Windows. Cost unknown. Sell 11 million copies. Playtime. Main story 10 hours, main plus extras 13 hours, completionist 38 hours. Resident Evil Village, released in 2021, is a direct and successful continuation of the new path that began with Resident Evil 7. The game cleverly establishes its place in the series. The name Village contains the Roman numeral for 8, wait, to show that this title is the 8th main installment in the series storyline. Story-wise, the game once again places us in the role of Ethan Winters. The story begins a few years after the events of the 7th game with the kidnapping of Ethan's daughter, Rose, and leads him to a mysterious, snow-covered village in Eastern Europe. This direct narrative connection adds more depth to Ethan's character development and creates an emotional and perilous journey for the player. The game's gameplay is a masterful blend of the horror elements from the 7th game and the popular action of Resident Evil 4. Although the first-person camera perspective is retained, the game has become significantly more action-oriented with an increase in enemies, more varied weapons, and the introduction of a shopping and selling system from the Duke. The village and its surrounding areas, from the Gothic castle Dimitrescu to the eerie house Beneviento, each offer a different feel and style of horror, which is considered one of the game's main strengths. Overall, Resident Evil Village was another great success for Capcom that managed to satisfy both critics and players. By presenting an engaging story, charismatic and memorable villains, the Four Lords, and creating an entertaining balance between horror and action, the game proved that the Resident Evil series is still at its peak. This game has 2 downloadable content packages: Resident Evil Re.Verse, which is a free multiplayer component that was released with the main game. It was met with a cold reception and could not replicate the success of the story mode. The full experience of this mode takes about 7 hours, and the paid DLC, the Mercenaries, Additional Orders. This DLC is part of the Winter's expansion and adds new characters like Chris Redfield, Heisenberg, and Lady Dimitrescu to the popular Mercenaries mode. This DLC offers an arcade and entertaining experience that adds about 2 hours of new content to the game. Resident Evil 4 Remake. Release 2023. Meta 93. Release platforms: PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox One and Series, Windows. Cost unknown. Sell 10 million copies. Playtime: main story 16 hours, main plus extras 21 hours, completionist 64 hours. The original Resident Evil 4, released in 2005, is considered not only one of the most successful and popular titles in the series, but also one of the most influential games in history. For this reason, remaking such a work, which holds a place in the hearts of millions of fans, was an incredibly difficult and high-risk task. However, Resident Evil 4 Remake, released in 2023, rose to the challenge masterfully as a very successful and intelligent remake that managed to meet the high expectations of fans and critics. By preserving the core of the original's revolutionary gameplay, Capcom has significantly improved it by adding modern and effective mechanics like the knife parry system. The game's atmosphere evokes a greater sense of fear and tension compared to the original, and the graphics, thanks to the RE engine, display stunning visual details in the environments and characters. This high production quality was also clearly evident in its reception. Resident Evil 4 Remake, receiving scores above 90 out of 100 from most reputable outlets, solidified its place as one of the most acclaimed and best games of its release year. This success demonstrated that the original's compelling formula is still potent and remains appealing to a new generation of players. The game's experience was also expanded with more content post-launch. Capcom first made the popular arcade mode, the Mercenaries, available as a free update. Additionally, the high-quality story DLC, Separate Ways, was released as a paid expansion, which tells the game's story from the perspective of Ada Wong and adds a complete and valuable narrative chapter to the overall experience.